attracted many new visitors and added a whole new dimension to what the museum has to offer. She's our current chair of the Gardens Tour program, or the tours, and that was a tremendous job. She took it on cheerfully and is doing a tremendous job. That's next weekend, by the way, so don't forget to attend.
If anybody wants tickets, I got them.
There you go. Thank you. We sent you to that. Thank you. Yeah. We're hoping the weather stays like it is now, so the gardens can all recover from all this bad weather. So anyway, even though Lynn's not here, we want to thank her for, we're just really grateful for all that she's done, and we're going to miss her terribly. We're hoping that she'll visit often and maybe come to our next potluck dinner. As Sally said, our next gardens tour is next weekend. Hope the weather is good, and if anyone is still needing tickets, we consider you have some, Sally. And thanks for all of you who have been working so hard to make this another really successful event. Next time you're at the museum, don't forget to look for our new walking tour, our revised walking tour, thanks to Eldora and Bob Hoyer. We really, truly appreciate their dedication to excellence, and we know that when a really difficult job needs to be done, we can always call on Bob and Eldora. So look for the new walking tour. It's got some new maps and pictures, and it's really, really a good brochure. The next thing is the Wine and Art Festival, which is May 2nd and 3rd, and be sure and attend because we benefit in many ways from that event. If anyone would like to help, we're going to have the open during the wine festival, so if anyone is able to help as a docent, we can contact Connie because we can always use extra docents during those 2 days. It's a lot of fun. It's a good event. Now, Connie, would you come up because I have something really special to do here. You're supposed to come up. Yeah, would you come up? And while she does that, before I turn the program over to Carmen, I'd like to make a presentation to the Clayton Historical Society from our really good British friends, Keith and Margaret Holford of Bugsworth, England. I tried to convince them to wait until they visit in the fall so that they could make this presentation themselves. But Keith insisted that I present this gift to the museum at our spring meeting. So those of you that have been following the twinning story, does everybody know about the twinning story? Clayton and Bugsworth. I found out that Steve Weir does not. He needs to read his newsletter. But as you know, Clayton and Bugsworth, the village where Joel Clayton was born, are now, we call it sister cities. They call it twinning. Anyway, Bugsworth has new village signs indicating their sister city relationship with Clayton. Those of you that know Keith not only know that he's the village historian, but now he's taken on to the job as the village photographer, recording all the activities, village activities. Recording on film all village activities. So, and I want to make this really clear, on behalf of Keith and Margaret Holford, I'd like to present to the Historical Society these matted and framed photographs taken by Keith of the new village signs. So, they really are nice. So when we redo that area of museum time, this to present.
We have a place to hang them.
And I will say that there is a similar, not the matting and the frame is a little bit different, but don't tell anybody that the city offices are going to receive the same similar. We haven't done that yet. I have to call and find out how to do that. But the city will receive a similar, hoping that they will get the hint, and maybe the city of Clayton will redesign their signs so that they will also indicate that we are twinned with Bugsworth. So, with that in mind, Carmen, would you like to come and introduce our guest speaker? Thank you.
really my pleasure tonight to introduce our guest speaker. He was here at our last meeting, and we're real glad to have him back because he brought a lot of interesting things to look at this time. So at this time, I'd like to introduce Steve Weir, who is a Contra Costa County Clerk Recorder, and Janine Ziegler, his assistant. And Steve is here to speak about the vast assortment of documents and historical items currently stored in Martinez. So this is especially interesting to those of us who have been around here for a while. And I'm sure that any of the newer comers will enjoy it also. So we know what's in Martinez.
Well, thanks, Carmen, and thanks, ladies and gentlemen, for another great potluck. I think you found out the secret about how to get me back. And to be polite, I've tried everything at least once. But I actually do appreciate the chance to come and share your potluck and be part of your program. I want to grab my notes. Being the county clerk recorder carries a certain responsibility with it, part of which I think is to maintain the continuum of the county record. And our county records for the clerk and for the recorder go back to 1849. And in 1989, when I took over upon the death of the previous clerk recorder, James Olson, I came in from the outside, so everything was fairly new to me. But I did take over his office that had been vacated for about 4 months, and the door had been locked. And so when I came on board, the secretary said, here's Mr. Olson's office. We locked it up just the way it was when he had left, and this is true. And so when I went into that office, I came in and saw a giant gray metal desk, and I sat down at that desk. And I really didn't have the opportunity to have him tell me what the office was like, what some of the problems were, the things that were going on. So I walk into this office and I sit down at this large desk, and the first thing I do is open the drawer that's right over the seat well. And there are assorted pennies, nickels, and dimes in there. There are paper clips, there are cards, but there's a big envelope. And it says, to whom it may concern. Open in case of emergency. And I figured, this is it. This is an emergency, so I'm going to open that. And when I opened it, there were 3 envelopes. And it said, upon the occasion, of your first emergency, open envelope number 1. And on the occasion of your second emergency, open envelope number 2, so on and so forth. So I thought, well, okay, this is going to be good, set it aside. Well, having not had a boss there for about 4 months, suffice it to say, there were some personnel problems. Things weren't resolved. And so, being the good historian that I am, I saved these envelopes. My first personnel problem popped up within about 4 weeks. Remembering the envelopes, go and pull it out. There it was, words of wisdom from the past, blame the past administration. I said, you know, this problem, I just got here, you know, it's this past administration thing. I'll be darned if things didn't quiet up very quickly, and I thought, this isn't going to be so bad. So, about a year later, personnel problems again pop up, and I thought, I remember that envelope. Go out and pull envelope number 2. Pull out the words of wisdom, reorganize. So I moved that group over here, this group over there. Things quieted down, and I thought, now this is going to be a piece of cake. And things were really quiet until about 2 years ago, when I had some problems in my elections office.
Oh, yeah.
Some of you may remember that.
Yes.
I was afraid to open the envelope. So I'm going to open the envelope for your historical perspective now as we speak. Said, prepare 3 envelopes. actually did. Well, we've had some interesting times. I'm responsible for the elections office. I'm responsible for the recorder's office, where your property documents are recorded, birth, death, and marriage are recorded. And I had the courts for a long, long time. Clerks no longer have courts, and I've since then lost the courts. But within the first year of having taken over the courts, my assistant said, you know, they've moved a bunch of pallets of documents out of an old warehouse, and it's now up in the motor pool. And we're going to send it to recycling because they've been microfilmed. And I thought, well, okay, that sounds all right, but actually I want to go look at it. And the motor pool was about a half a block away, so I go up to the motor pool, and there are pallets and pallets and pallets of old books that probably haven't been touched in 40 years. And they looked unorganized, they looked very dusty, and someone had literally just thrown them onto the pallets. And as I start picking up these books, they're the records that go back to 1850 for the county. They're the original court documents that set up our first 3 townships. There are original court documents that set up the appointment of our official for the county. And I say, well, I don't think we're going to throw them out. They had been microfilmed, but we decided we'd try to store them. And it was a scramble just to find a spot to put these documents. And lo and behold, the recorder's office had the same thing. Had a warehouse on shell property that was leased, and just literally rows and rows and rows of books that go back to 1850. And so we found a spot to save them. And then I no longer was clerk of the court. And it looked like the new clerk was going to send these things, not to recycle, but to throw them out. And we couldn't let that happen. And so they got stored in the post office basement there in Martinez. And fortunately for you and I, Mary Ellen Jones and her group, who are here tonight, agreed to take these books and to store them. And so the old court records that go back to 1850 are now in the tender hands of the Contra Costa Historical Society. And I don't want to embarrass anybody, it's not my job to do that, but I think we ought to give them a debt of thanks. We're taking on a tremendous amount of documents. The records that we had at Shell Avenue for the recorder's office, we now have a warehouse in Martinez that we've organized and have preserved for the time being. But it's not the end of the story. And the story, I think, is worth telling. Your society was the first that we put on a full-blown display, well, at least at the library. We've displayed our books once before in Danville. And so when you showed an interest, we put together sort of a cross-section of some of those documents. And we decided that we'd actually come forward and bring some of the documents to you tonight so that you'd have a chance to see some of this, what I think is a living history, something that ought to be protected from moisture and from fire, ought to be protected from termites, all of which our records are subject to, ought to be protected from acid. And so what I want to do is just do kind of a walkthrough of some of these documents with you tonight, give you a flavor of what we have and what we're trying to do to save them. Jeannie Ziegler, who is my executive secretary, literally put together the display, if you had a chance to see it. How many saw that at the Clayton library? So it was a fun display, it was a great display. We're going to give you a little closer look at those today. But I want to just kind of touch on some things. In 1873, got my notes here, there was a murder of Valentine, and I'm going to spell his name, I think it's Eschler, it's E-I-S-C-H-L-E-R, about 8 miles from, in the Marsh Creek area, about 8 miles from Antioch. And the story's interesting. It's published in the History of Contra Costa County from 1882 by the W.A. Slocum Company. And so we find an account, a 2-page account of this story. I'll make the long story short. There was a Marshall Martin, who was a hand on the ranch of Mr. and Mrs., is it Eichler? And Mrs. Eichler decides that she doesn't like Mr. Eichler. And she gets Mr. Martin to buy some arsenic, and they put together some stewed pumpkins, but he doesn't want it that night. And they get thrown down the privy. Well, they try it again, but Mr. Martin gets kind of cold feet, so he convinces her to throw him out. And they decide that they're going to get some wine for Mr. Eichler and then use some of the arsenic and do him under, and that doesn't work. So Mr. Martin is supposed to shoot Mr. Eichler as they go into town to get some supplies. But on the way back, they pick up a passenger and the opportunity is lost. On and on and on. Finally, Mrs. Eichler has Mr. Eichler over the tongue of a wagon and clobbers him, not once but twice. And the two of them drag him off into the barn and leave. And they come back and Mr. Martin's sitting up. Well, they finish the job and decide that they'll leave him there, and they send, Mrs. Eichler sends Marshal Martin off to get some witnesses to the fact that a horse kicked him and killed him. But when the witnesses get there, there are so many burrs in Mr. Eichler's shirt that they suspect foul play. It's apparent that he didn't die there, he got dragged there. And they call for the constable, and the constable comes, and ultimately they find a spot where there's a lot of flies gathering, and they see that there are flies on Mrs. Eichler's shoes, and they determine through an inquest that it's murder. And they go through the whole murder case and the murder trial that ultimately convicted Marshal Martin of murder, and he was executed in Contra Costa County for that crime, and it wasn't a pretty execution. And I'm not going to go into the details of it, but you find reference to this in some publication of the county, and then you find in the records the stenographer's notes from that trial. And I don't take shorthand. I tried it, and it wasn't my forte, but you'll find record after record after record of the shorthand that was taken in that case. And then the stenographer would do their transcript in longhand, in beautiful longhand. And so what we have is a complete record of those cases, stenographer's notes, cryptically taken, and then transcribed in longhand. And so that was the method for keeping records back at that part of our history. Stenographer kept cryptic shorthand notes, went back and beautifully hand wrote out those transcripts, which ultimately went to the Supreme Court because the Supreme Court had to review all death penalty cases. And so we want to display for you tonight, just quickly so you can see what technology looked like back then. and it worked. We have a tremendous amount of records, and I brought you some boxes. And we'll let you kind of see some of these documents. We want to be careful about food, we want to be careful about beverages, and about acid, so we've brought some gloves. We'd like to show you some of those records, but what's been fun for me is to go through these records and to see coroner's inquest records, or the grand jury records. The grand jury was called together every year, and because the county was diverse and difficult to get to, you were put up in Martinez in a hotel for 3 or 4 days while you went through your duty. And part of your duty was to look at what the clerk was doing, and the sheriff was doing, and the district attorney was doing, and how our county hospital was managed. And I tried to keep some notes on these so that we can actually have an index to them. But from the August 10, 1876 report, it's M.P. Barbas as foreman, commenting on the 13 patients that were in the county hospital. What they commented was this, that the hospital was too close to the business portion of Martinez because the inmates were usually found at the local saloons, quote, gratifying their appetite for liquor. And they recommended moving the building out towards Alhambra Creek to get away from those businesses because they felt that it was those very businesses that caused those people to be in the county hospital in the first place. And then they recommended some whitewashing of it. But a lot of the reports were kind of anecdotally humorous like this, saying that the food was good for an indigent, but if the indigent was sick, the food wasn't good enough. So they were commenting on food, the condition of the sheets, the condition of the ventilation in the jail. This was the issue that our citizens were worried about back then with our county government. And so there is anecdotal information year after year about what was going on in the county from the perspective of the grand jurors with things like the county hospital. And it makes kind of for some fun reading. And I've had some fun with that. Before my office was burnt on September 14th, 1995, I was the clerk of the court, they were firebombed. I had hired a records manager for the county to see if we couldn't in fact start to develop a record storage program for inactive files and for archival records. And I had a gentleman from Salt Lake County named Bob Westby work for me. When the fire hit, he transferred over to fire recovery. His contract was up and he left. But his name was Bob Westby, and this was Bob's box. From Bob's office. Bob introduced us to acid-neutral boxes and acid-neutral folders, and to our imitation of a certain notorious or infamous rock star. The white gloves. These are actually the kind of gloves that we're supposed to use to handle the documents, to try to keep our oils off of them. If you look at some of our books, you're going to see the oil accumulation on the pages, especially where you turn pages. And so we're not putting on a show, but we do want to point out some documents. And if Jeannie will help me set these up, then we're going to ask you to come forward and take a look at them. Now, I'll speak so hopefully I can be heard. If you attended the display, we showed you some astray records. And astray is a legal term. It's an animal that went astray, and you recorded that you found this animal, and if it had marks and brands, you recorded those, and the owner had due notice to come get their animal, or it was yours. And in 1851 on Sand Hill, there was a neighbor of John Marsh that found some animals, and John Marsh found some animals, but to get from... This is the county...
Yeah. I enjoy going through all this. Yeah. This is one of the things we're going to do. Actually, this is where it starts.
The official seal.
Right. A little scrolly around your name is official.
Right. Another one over here, see? Simpler days.
And that's how they did their seals right here.
Yeah.
Yeah, you know, it's funny to watch them.
I don't mean shorthand. It's amazing. Simply amazing. Beautiful. Yeah, I did a with a.
This has an index in the back.
Common name. On a lot of property. Nealon Brown. He was Lafayette. One of his great grandsons still lives on that property. Amador. Danny's name, but you have to end up around here. Yes.
Yeah, yeah.
These are marks and brands. This is an index of the marks and brands that are inside. And the index, they just wrote it down on the left.
It's all brown.
You can go find them. This is Homestead.
Simon Bloom.
Just like Mark, Gordon Jr. I think that's what this is, or Marsh. I haven't gone through this book, but I kind of put through it down.
Yeah, the handwriting was amazing, yeah.
Yeah, that building is right on the brand. Just a little bit different than some of the
Going to the than we are now.
Yeah, that's
You know, there might be, I don't know that. Most of
Oh, God, a long while. George is right outside the door here.
right there. Please tell me about his